The soldiers couldn't cross the water. That single religious prohibition saved an entire people from slavery and produced one of the most unusual human settlements on Earth. Ganvié, a village of 20,000 people built entirely on stilts above Lake Nukue in Benin, exists because the warriors of the Dahomey kingdom were forbidden by their own spiritual codes from entering water. The Tofinu people didn't stumble onto this protection by accident. They read the rules of their enemy precisely and built their lives around that gap. Every house, every market stall, every school sits on wooden poles driven into the lake bed. There are no streets, only canals. Children learn to paddle before they're fully steady on solid ground. The entire economy orbits the lake. Fishing isn't a tradition here, it's the logic of staying put in a place that keeps you alive. What's easy to miss about Ganvié is that the water was never the point. The water was the answer to a specific threat at a specific historical moment, and the community simply never left. That pattern, extreme geography as a response to extreme pressure, is what connects every place in this episode. A monastery carved into a cliff at nearly 4,000 meters with no road and no signal. Greek hermitages perched on 600-meter rock pillars, accessible for 3 centuries only by rope and net. A Dutch star-shaped fortress ringed by concentric moats, built to control the single passable route through impassable marshland. A floating village in Thailand, founded because its people were simply denied the right to own land. Each location is an argument made in stone, wood, or water. 13 of them, ranked by one measure only: how far people were willing to go to stay exactly where they were. Number 13 will challenge your idea of livable. Number 1 will change your idea of possible. A village of 250 people receives 80,000 tourists a year. That's over 300 visitors for every single resident. And it all started with a coat of blue paint. Number 13 on our list is Júzcar, a small village in the mountains of Malaga, southern Andalusia, and its transformation is one of the more unlikely stories in modern rural history. In 2011, Sony was looking for a location to launch the animated film The Smurfs globally. They chose Júzcar, and their request was straightforward and bizarre in equal measure. Paint the entire village blue. Every facade, every stone wall, every flower pot, every bench, the church, all of it. 360 buildings turned an intense, saturated blue. When the premiere wrapped, Sony did the decent thing and offered to repaint everything back to white, the traditional colour of Andalusian villages. The residents held a vote. The majority said no. That decision, made in a village that had no tourists, a dying local economy, and a population made up mostly of elderly people whose children had long since left for the cities, turned out to be the most consequential vote any of them had ever cast. Within the first year, visitor numbers climbed from virtually 0 to tens of thousands. The blue Smurfs now stand life-size on street corners. Cafes and souvenir shops opened. The village that had been quietly fading found itself on travel itineraries around the world. What Sony intended as a promotional stunt became something else entirely, a collective act of reinvention. The blue walls against the green mountain slopes, the Andalusian sun sharp overhead, white flowers on blue windowsills. The place looks like a film set. Which is, in a way, exactly how it started. Júzcar lands at number 13 because the villages still ahead of us owe their strangeness to history, geography, and survival, not to a marketing campaign, however accidentally brilliant it turned out to be. There are no roads in Giethoorn, not damaged roads, not unpaved roads, no roads at all. Around 2,600 people live here permanently, and not one of them drives a car to their front door. That is not a marketing slogan, it is simply how the village has worked for 7 centuries. Giethoorn sits in the Dutch province of Overijssel, and its logic was never aesthetic. In the 13th century, peat diggers settled the swampy ground and immediately faced a practical problem. How do you move heavy loads across a landscape that is mostly water? You dig canals. They dug more than 6 kilometers of them, not to create something beautiful, but to survive. When the peat ran out, the canals remained, and the village adapted around them so completely that asphalt became unnecessary. There are roughly 40 small bridges, each one leading to a separate house. That is the address system. Daily life runs on flat-bottomed electric boats, nearly silent, moving through channels barely wider than the vessels themselves. Residents use them to carry groceries, transport children, receive guests. The boats are not a lifestyle choice or a tourist performance. They are infrastructure. In winter, when the canals freeze hard enough, school children switch to ice skates and glide to class between the willows and reeds. This has been happening for generations and continues today. Giethoorn reached global visibility in 1958 when Dutch filmmaker Bert Hanstra shot a comedy here called Fanfare. The camera drifted along the waterways, and audiences worldwide saw a village where the 20th century had apparently forgotten to build roads. The film turned a quiet backwater into an internationally recognized name. More than 1 million tourists now visit every year, which creates a tension the locals navigate carefully. The silence that defines the place is also the thing most threatened by its own fame. Number 12 on our list. A place where the loudest regular sound is water lapping against a wooden hull. The next entry on this list faced the opposite kind of deprivation. Not too much water, but too little light. A village that spent centuries in shadow and eventually decided to aim a mirror at the sun. For 83 days every year, the sun simply does not reach the center of Viganella. Not because of clouds, not because of fog, but because the mountain walls surrounding this small village in the Antrona Valley of the northern Italian Alps are angled in such a way that direct sunlight becomes geometrically impossible between November and February. The light is there. Residents could see it every day, grazing the upper ridges of the cliffs high above their heads, never descending. That distinction, visible but unreachable, is what made Viganella's situation so psychologically acute. Over generations, the absence accumulated. Seasonal depression was common. Vitamin D deficiency was a medical baseline, not an exception. The sensation of being sealed inside a cold stone box for nearly 3 months each year drove a slow but steady emigration. By 2006, the village had shrunk to around 180 people. The solution that emerged that year came from architect Giacomo Bonzani, and it was as literal as it sounds. If the sun cannot get in, you build something to bring it in yourself. A steel mirror, 8 by 5 meters, computer-controlled, mounted on the cliff face at 1,100 meters above the village, engineered to track the sun's arc across the sky and continuously redirect its reflection down onto the central piazza. The system relied on electric motors and software calibrated to precise astronomical data. Total cost was approximately €100,000, partly funded by the local municipality. When the mirror was switched on in December 2006, villagers gathered in the square and felt direct sunlight on their faces for the first time that winter. Reflected, slightly diffuse, but physically real. Up to 6 hours of it per day. Number 11 on our list, Viganella stands as proof that geography is a condition, not a verdict. If an Italian village could reverse its own shadow with a mirror, consider what a Dutch village did by abandoning the idea of roads altogether. There is no ground beneath the Uros people's feet, and there hasn't been for over 500 years. The floating islands of Lake Titicaca, straddling the border of Peru and Bolivia at nearly 3,800 meters above sea level, are not a tourist reconstruction or a cultural performance. They are home. Rank 10 on this journey belongs to one of the most radical feats of human adaptation ever attempted. An entire community that decided, when threatened by Inca expansion, not to flee inland or surrender to the empire, but to build the very earth they needed out of reeds. The totora reed, which grows abundantly across the lake's shallow edges, became the answer to every question. Construction material, food source, boat-building fibre, furniture, bedding. Totora is the Euros world compressed into a single plant. The islands themselves are layered structures, woven and stacked until the surface feels firm yet subtly elastic underfoot. Around 80 of these islands exist on the lake today. Each one is in a constant state of managed decay. The lower layers rot in the water, while residents add fresh totora on top every few weeks. Stop maintaining the island, and the island disappears beneath you. Not metaphorically, literally. The visual experience resists easy processing. Golden reed platforms drifting on high-altitude blue water, thin, cold air, silence broken only by wind. You step onto the island and feel the earth move in a way solid ground never does. That slight give underfoot is 5 centuries of ingenuity holding up against gravity and water simultaneously. No stone, no concrete, no fixed foundation. Just the continuous human act of laying down one more layer before the last one is gone. 10th place on this list is not about a place that was built, it is about a place that is always being built. The children of Ganvié learn to paddle before they learn to walk. That is not a figure of speech. There is almost no land to walk on. Number 9 on this list is a city of roughly 20,000 people built entirely on stilts above the brackish waters of Lake Nokoué in southern Benin, just a few kilometers from the Atlantic coast. And it exists because of one of the most calculated acts of collective survival in African history. Here is the paradox at the heart of Ganvié. This place was built by people who had every reason not to be here. The lake offered no natural resources that would have drawn settlers, no strategic trade advantage, no particular comfort. What it offered was one thing only: safety. In the 17th century, the Tofinu people were being hunted. The kingdom of Dahomey had become one of the most aggressive suppliers of enslaved people to European traders, and its armies swept through neighboring communities in devastating raids. The Tofinu could not outrun them on land. So they stopped trying. They knew something the Dahomey warriors did not know how to overcome. A religious prohibition prevented Dahomey soldiers from entering water. Their gods held the army on dry ground. The Tofinu took that knowledge, gathered their tools, their timber, and their skill, and moved onto the lake. The water did not trap them, it freed them. What they built over the following generations is staggering in its completeness. Around 2,000 stilt houses now cover the surface of a lake that stretches across roughly 150 square kilometers. Every function of urban life has been adapted to water. A floating market operates each morning, with canoes loaded with fish, vegetables, and cloth weaving between houses, goods exchanged through windows and over railings. Fishing nets dry directly above the surface. Cooking fires send smoke across the water at dusk. The only solid ground in the entire settlement is a single small island where the school was built, because education, at least, requires something that does not move. Ganvié is often called the Venice of Africa. The comparison does the place a disservice. Venice was built on ambition. Ganvié was built on terror, and that distinction carries the entire moral weight of its existence. The threats today are slower and harder to fight. Lake levels shift. Pollution from the surrounding region creeps into the water. The wooden stilts that hold every house above the surface require constant replacement. The ingenuity that once outmaneuvered an army now has to outmaneuver environmental collapse. The wall that saved a people is the same wall that may one day fail them. Number 8 on our list. Aogashima is technically part of Tokyo. Let that sit for a moment. The same administrative unit that contains Shinjuku's skyscrapers and the Imperial Palace also contains a tiny volcanic island in the Philippine Sea where every schoolchild carries a personal gas mask. The distance between those two realities is roughly 350 kilometers south of the capital, and an entire world apart. About 170 people live on Aogashima, and they live inside an active double volcano. The outer rim of the caldera rises up to 200 meters above the inhabited interior, a ring of solidified lava enclosing the village like walls of a natural fortress. At the center of that outer crater sits a second, smaller cone called Marubochi, which continuously leaks sulfurous gas. Residents keep portable sulfur concentration detectors at home, not as safety equipment in any formal sense, but the way you keep an umbrella by the door. The island's relationship with catastrophe has a specific date, 1785. The volcano erupted without warning and killed roughly half the population. Some died under lava and ash, others drowned trying to escape by boat into open water. The survivors were not permitted to return for nearly 50 years, until Japanese authorities officially reopened the island for resettlement. Everyone living there today descends from people who made a deliberate choice to go back. That choice comes with modern constraints that haven't softened much. The ferry cancels approximately half its scheduled runs each year due to sea conditions. The helicopter doesn't fly in fog. Fog over Aogashima is routine. Several days each month, the island is completely cut off. No evacuation possible, no way in or out. The gas masks in kitchen drawers aren't relics of an anxious past. They're Tuesday. 3,000 people once lived inside a single rock. Not beside it, not beneath it in tunnels. Inside it, in rooms and corridors and ventilated shafts carved directly into the volcanic mass, with the stone itself as walls, ceiling, and natural climate control all at once. This is Uchisa, number 7 on our list, and it is one of the more radical solutions to the problem of human habitation that any civilization has ever produced. The geology comes first, because without it, nothing else makes sense. Millions of years ago, 3 ancient volcanoes blanketed what is now central Turkey in deep layers of ash. That ash compressed over time into tuff, a soft, cuttable stone that behaves almost like hardwood when you work it with tools. Erosion then sculpted the tuff into the landscape Cappadocia is famous for. Cones, columns, and tapered towers the locals call fairy chimneys, stretching across the horizon like a frozen forest made of grey-pink smoke. Uchisa is the tallest formation in the entire region, 60 meters above the surrounding plain. And it is not a castle built on top of a rock. The rock is the castle. The first excavations may date to the Hittite period, roughly 3,500 years ago, though most of the identifiable spaces belong to the early Byzantine and medieval eras. What accumulated over those centuries is staggering. Thousands of individual rooms, connecting corridors, staircases cut into the stone, ventilation shafts, dovecots, and observation points near the summit. The engineering logic behind all of it is thermal mass. Inside the rock, the temperature holds at approximately 15 degrees Celsius year-round. No variation, no adjustment, no mechanical system required. In summer, when the Cappadocian plain reaches 40 degrees, the rock absorbs heat and keeps the interior cool. In winter, the stored warmth radiates inward. The mountain runs itself. Today, the village of Uchisa surrounds the base and slopes of the rock. Some chambers have collapsed, others sit empty, others have been converted into hotels and residential spaces. You can still climb through the interior, up carved steps, through dark corridors that narrow and then open again, and emerge at the top with the entire valley laid out below you. That panoramic view was the strategic point. Júzcar commanded the central route through Cappadocia. Its method was concealment. Hide the population inside the geology itself. The next place on our list took the opposite approach entirely. For 200 years, an entire village was legally invisible. The buildings existed, people lived in them, but according to the kingdom's inspectors, there was nothing there, just rubble. That vanishing act was engineered into the architecture itself, and it worked every single time. Welcome to Alberobello, number 6 on our list, a small town in Puglia in southern Italy, where more than 1,500 cone-shaped houses cover the hillsides in dense white clusters that seem to defy both gravity and common sense. These structures are called trulli, and their most important feature is what's missing: mortar. Every trullo is built from dry-stacked limestone slabs, laid in concentric rings that tighten upward into a cone. At the very top sits a single capstone. Pull it out and the roof collapses within minutes. The whole village could be reduced to unrecognizable piles of stone in roughly an hour. That was not a flaw. That was the mechanism. From the 15th century onward, the land around Alberobello was controlled by the feudal Acquaviva family. Under Neapolitan law, any permanent settlement required a royal charter and triggered taxation. The lords found a clean legal loophole. Structures that can be dismantled don't qualify as permanent, so they ordered their peasants to build without mortar. When royal tax inspectors approached, a signal went through the village, keystones were knocked out, roofs caved in, and the inspectors found nothing but ruins. They filed their reports and left. The villagers rebuilt. This cycle repeated across generations. Destruction on demand, reconstruction as routine. The architecture that looks so whimsical to a modern tourist was, in its time, a precision instrument of tax evasion and feudal self-interest. The arrangement finally ended in 1797, when King Ferdinand IV visited Alberobello in person and granted it official status as an independent settlement. The need to hide the village was gone, but the construction methods stayed. Dry-stacked limestone remained the local tradition, and it survives to this day. In 1996, UNESCO added Alberobello to its World Heritage List. The cones are whitewashed, and many carry symbols painted directly onto the stone: crosses, suns, hearts, believed locally to guard against the evil eye. The place looks almost unreal. Hundreds of white cones packed tight on a hillside, narrow lanes running between grey walls. A village built to disappear, now preserved forever. From a town that hid itself from the state, we move to a fortress built by state engineers for one explicit purpose: to control the only road through impassable marshland. Next stop, Bourtong, the Netherlands. Point 5 on our list is a village where people still live inside a weapon. Bourtanga, in the northeastern Netherlands, is a star-shaped fortress built in 1580 and the only dry road through the impassable marshes of Groningen, and it has never stopped being inhabited. That combination, a functioning military fortification with actual residents, sounds like a contradiction. It isn't. It is the result of one extraordinarily specific engineering logic applied without compromise for over 4 centuries. Willem of Orange's military engineers were handed a geometric problem: seal the single passable route through the bog. The solution was a perfect 5-pointed star, and every element of that shape was calculated rather than decorative. Each angular bastion provided flanking fire across the faces of its 2 neighbours, leaving no dead ground anywhere along the perimeter. An attacking force had no angle of approach that wasn't simultaneously covered by at least 2 firing positions. The concentric moats and canals surrounding the star weren't just water obstacles, they were a hydraulic network that weaponized the surrounding marsh itself. Inside the star, a real community existed on those terms. A garrison, craftsmen, merchants, and a few hundred civilians lived within the bastions. The only way in or out was a drawbridge operated on a fixed schedule. In 1851, the Dutch military decommissioned Bourton. Modern artillery had made star forts obsolete across Europe, and the fortress was left to decay for over a century, canals silting up, earthworks slumping, the geometry slowly losing definition. Then, in 1968, the Netherlands committed to a full restoration. Not a museum reconstruction, but a living one. People still live here, drawbridges still rise at dusk, and on weekends, residents dress in 17th century clothing. From the air, the star reads as clearly as a diagram, 5 sharp points divided by water. From this mathematically precise killing ground, standing in the marshes, we move to a village where the architectural trick was invented not against armies, but against tax collectors. Over 1,500 people live somewhere they were never supposed to. No land, no road, no shoreline, just open sea, and a village built directly on top of it. Koh Phangan, number 4 on our list, sits in Phang Nga Bay in southern Thailand, wedged against a sheer limestone cliff that drops straight into the water. It should not exist, and yet it has existed for more than 5 centuries. The founding logic was brutally simple. When a group of fishing families arrived here from the Indonesian archipelago, likely in the late 15th century, they were not permitted to own land in the Siamese kingdom. Foreign settlers had no territorial rights. So they looked at what the law could not touch, and they built there instead. Wooden stilts hammered into the seafloor, planks laid across them, houses raised on top. The massive limestone monolith behind the settlement became a natural wall, blocking wind and offering shelter. Over generations, that initial platform expanded into a dense, functioning community. Today, the village contains a mosque, a market, a school, and a cluster of restaurants, all suspended above water. At low tide, the sea retreats and leaves mud and shallows beneath the floorboards. At high tide, boats pass directly under the buildings. There is no road connecting Koh Phangan to the mainland. There never has been. Every person, every sack of rice, every piece of timber arrives by boat. In 1986, a group of boys from the village watched the FIFA World Cup on television and decided they wanted to play. The problem, not a single square metre of dry ground was available anywhere in the settlement. Their solution was to dismantle old fishing boats, salvage the planks, and nail them onto stilts over the water, constructing a football pitch that floated above the sea. Balls lost over the edge were simply gone. That team, playing on a waterlogged wooden field with no runoff space and no margin for error, eventually placed third in a regional Thai tournament. Koh Phangan makes one argument clearly. Humans do not build where it is convenient. They build where they must. What comes next on our list takes that principle to an even more uncompromising extreme. Number 3 on our list is a village of 18 people that became one of the most photographed places in Northern Europe, not because anyone planned it that way, but because a waterfall drops 30 meters straight into the Atlantic, with no beach, no shore, nothing between the basalt cliff and the open ocean. That image of Mula Fossur above Gassadalur has circulated so widely that most people who recognize it have never heard the village's name. The Faroe Islands are 18 volcanic outcrops suspended in the North Atlantic between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland, where the wind is a near-constant presence and fog erases the horizon for months at a time. Gassadalur sits on a narrow ledge at the western tip of the island of Vágar. A cluster of stone houses with turf roofs pressed against the edge of a cliff, as far from the centre of anything as geography will allow. Until 2004, the village was functionally cut off from the rest of Vágar. The only route in went over a mountain pass, and in a storm or an ice event, that crossing was genuinely life-threatening. A postman made the walk once a week. Medical emergencies were handled by helicopter when the weather permitted. People stayed not because leaving was impossible, but because the relationship between a person and a place like this operates on different terms, built from memory, repetition, and the knowledge that this exact configuration of rock, wind, and falling water exists nowhere else on Earth. A 700-meter tunnel blasted through basalt in 2004 changed the logistics overnight. The village gained road access to Vargas Airport, but the tunnel didn't reverse the population decline. The paradox is still unresolved. Greater connectivity, fewer permanent residents. The tourists who now arrive to photograph the waterfall are looking at something the villagers never saw as scenery. It was always just the view from home. Our next stop takes verticality even further. We're heading to the top of sheer cliff faces where monks lived for centuries without ladders, hauled up over the void in woven rope baskets. For roughly 300 years, the only way to reach these monasteries was to climb into a rope net and trust it. There was no staircase, no ladder, no mechanical lift. Just a woven basket, a pulley, and whoever happened to be working the rope that day. Welcome to Meteora, number 2 on this list, and one of the most defiant feats of human construction on the planet. The sandstone pillars that rise above the plains of Thessaly are about 60 million years old. They formed as sediment on the floor of an ancient inland sea, and erosion spent millions of years carving them into vertical towers, some reaching 600 meters. They look unreachable from the valley floor, and for most of human history they were. The first hermits arrived here sometime around the 10th century, not to build anything, but to hide. The caves and crevices in the rock face offered shelter from raids, and isolation was the point. Gradually, solitary ascetics drew together into communities, and by the 14th and 15th centuries, monks had constructed 24 monasteries on the flat summits of these natural columns. Every stone used in those buildings was hauled up by rope. Every barrel of water, every sack of grain, every person who lived or worked inside those walls came up the same way. Contemporary accounts suggest the ropes were only replaced after they broke, not on a schedule, not after a set number of uses, after they broke. Stone steps cut directly into the rock face did not arrive until the 1920s, when the monks apparently decided that slightly less lethal access was acceptable. 6 of the original 24 monasteries are still active today. Together, they form a UNESCO World Heritage Site that draws hundreds of thousands of pilgrims and tourists every year. The red-roofed buildings still overhang sheer drops with an air of complete indifference to gravity. From the monasteries clinging to the sky above Greece, we move now to a village clinging to the very edge of a cliff above open ocean. 70 monks live without electricity, without roads, and without any connection to the outside world, and have done so, more or less, since the 10th century. That is not a crisis, that is the point. Phuktal Gompa ranks first on this list because it represents an absolute, the place where the human impulse towards spiritual withdrawal collided with the harshest terrain on Earth and held its ground. The monastery sits in the Lungnak River Gorge in Zanskar in India's Ladakh region at an elevation of 3,850 meters. It does not sit beside the cliff, it grows out of it. Monk cells, prayer halls, and covered walkways cling to the vertical rock face like the nests of cliff swallows, radiating in concentric rings from a natural cave that has been treated as sacred for over a millennium. Tradition holds that Lamken Gyatso meditated in that cave in the 10th century, becoming the first teacher to establish a community here. The cave became the heart, the cliff became the walls, the void below became the gate. There are no roads to Phuktal Gompa, there have never been roads. Reaching it requires a multi-day trek over mountain passes, along paths where sections of trail run as narrow ledges above the river. Ledges where the width of a full footstep is a small mercy, not a guarantee. In winter, the monastery is sealed off entirely for months. The isolation that makes this place logistically improbable is also what makes it irreplaceable. Pugtal holds manuscripts on Tibetan medicine, astrological treatises, and ritual practices that elsewhere have been modified beyond recognition or lost entirely. Monasteries with road access adapted. Monasteries near trade routes absorbed outside influence. Pugtal, unreachable and uncompromising, preserved by default what others surrendered by degrees. This is number one, and it is only the opening. Further along this journey, isolation will appear again, not as a spiritual discipline chosen by monks, but as the condition that determined whether an entire people survived at all. Monks lived here for 700 years with no way in except a rope and a net. That is not a metaphor. That is how you got to Meteora. You sat in a woven basket, someone above hauled the rope, and you rose up the sheer face of a stone pillar into a monastery that had decided the sky was safer than the ground. This is a documentary about 13 places that made the same bet, that staying was worth whatever it cost to stay. The math rarely adds up. In a Japanese volcanic crater, 770 people live with the open knowledge that the next eruption is not a possibility, but a schedule. On a high-altitude lake in South America, communities rebuild their floating reed islands by hand, continuously, because the water is always dissolving what they build. An Italian village went 83 days a year without sunlight until engineers bolted a mirror to the clifftop and angled it down into the square. A Dutch town removed its roads entirely and kept only canals. An African city rose on stilts above the water, not because the water was beautiful, but because the land belonged to people who were dangerous. In Cappadocia, 3,000 people carved their lives into the interior of a single rock formation and called it home. In Puglia, the trulli were built without mortar on purpose, designed to collapse on command, to disappear before the tax collector finished counting. A star-shaped fortress in the marshes still raises its bridges after dark. A Thai fishing village nailed a football pitch above the sea. 18 people on a Faroese cliff lived without a road until 2004. And in the vertical wall of the Zanskar Gorge, a cave monastery exists that you can only reach on foot through mountains on your own resolve. 13 places, 13 answers to one question. How far will people go to stay exactly where they are? All of it is real. All of it is right now.